Today we're taking a look at an incredible example of Magnus Carlsen's total mastery of our beloved royal game. Now, in the traditional sense, chess mastery has always been very closely correlated to one's ability to find and execute the objectively strongest move in a given position. But in the game you're about to witness, Magnus Carlsen takes it to the next level with a stunning demonstration that not only can he win with good moves, but he can win with bad moves as well. And I don't just mean kind of bad moves. I'm talking about a totally unsound queen sacrifice that the engine absolutely hates, giving him a 4-pawn disadvantage. But what our silicone overlord does not take into account is the extremely tricky nature of the resulting position, which Magnus's opponent is able to navigate pretty well for a while, but with fresh new problems getting thrown at him on virtually every move, he eventually cracks, he stops defending like an engine, and you can probably guess what happens next. But enough said, let's look at some moves. This game is from about 4 years ago, when Magnus Carlsen used to make regular appearances on LeeChess.org. It is a bullet game. He's up against a titled player, a GM with the username Watneg. Not sure if that's his real name, and I couldn't find any information on him. But Magnus has the white pieces here, and he opens the game with the tried and true e4. Watneg responds d6, the Pirt's defense, considered to be hyper-modern in that it allows white a fair degree of freedom to dominate the center, usually with an immediate d4, but Magnus goes for knight to c3, which is a bit of an oddity in this position, although not unheard of. Watneg could now transpose into a Sicilian defense with c5 if he wants to, but he's committed to his Pirts and so plays g6, preparing the kingside fianchetto. We now have d4, bishop to g7, and now my all-time favorite move, doesn't even matter what the position is, h4, the cultivated caveman attack, which, if allowed to proceed unhampered, will continue with the move h5 followed by h6. Watneg says that's okay, but if you do play h5, it's going to have to be a pawn sacrifice, as he now places his knight on f6, adding another set of rods and cones to that h5 square. Magnus has no interest in sacrificing a pawn at this juncture. He's got bigger fish to fry, and when I say fish, I'm actually referring to both his own pieces and the computer program Stockfish, whose circuits are about to be fried trying to make sense out of what Magnus is going to do in exactly 14 moves. Next, we have some normal piece development with bishop to e3, knight to c6, threatening knight to g4, achieving that favorable knight for bishop trade due to the fact that moving the bishop from e3 would lose the twice attacked pawn on d4. So we have f3 preventing knight to g4, and now comes e5 hitting that center, to which white's most tyrannical response would be d5, just seizing that central territory while leaving black's dark squared bishop hemmed in by his own pawn. But Magnus opts for knight g to e2. Apparently he's not in the mood for a closed position. Trying to slow maneuver your way to victory in a bullet game isn't all that much fun anyway. So what black should probably do here is play e takes d4 while he has the chance, but Watneg goes ahead and castles, once again inviting Magnus to play the very strong d5, which he once again declines, instead playing queen to d2. At which point, Watneg takes a quick look at the position, sees that he's safely castled, he's got decent control in the center, and so correctly concludes that he can now get away with d5, which according to the engine, totally equalizes the position. What Magnus should do now, assuming that his goal is to play good moves, which, as we've already established, isn't necessarily the case in this game, is play e takes d5 or d takes e5. Either capture is fine, but Magnus just ignores the central situation and castles queenside. And this actually gives black a bit of an advantage after Watneg's very strong reply, d takes e4. Why not? Let's open that d file and start pressuring d4. If white were to make the obvious recapture with f takes e4, the knight to g4 would be a bit awkward, opening the eyes of the bishop on g7, hitting the bishop on e3, which white would love to retreat to g1, keeping an eye on the center, but this would run into bishop to h6, defended by the knight, attacking and pinning the white queen to the king. So I hope you followed all of that. I know it looks like kind of a mess, but chess is kind of a messy game. What can I say? And then there's this kid who's been called the Messi of chess, but I'm getting a little sidetracked here. Now white's best move in this position just might be knight takes e4. But Magnus now decides to push his pawn to d5, attacking the knight on c6. This is a mistake as it allows black to lock in his extra pawn with e takes f3, counterattacking the knight on e2. When white's best reply would be to just recapture on f3, then black can move his attack knight to e7, and he's just a good clean pawn up, for which white has not nearly sufficient compensation. Watnig does not play his best move e takes f3, however. He decides to move his attacked knight, not to its best square, which just might be e7, with the idea of hopping into f5 supported by the bishop, but rather to a grim square on the rim, a5, giving Magnus the opportunity to gain a winning advantage now with his response, knight to g3. When after e takes f3 and g takes f3, black is a pawn to the good, only here it's not so good. White is threatening to play b4, winning the pony on a5, which has run out of squares. He's also threatening h5 to tear open the h-file towards the black king. Black would love to put a stop to that by playing h5 himself, but Watnig knows he needs to deal with his stranded stallion on a5, and so he plays c6, which is probably his best try. Now if Magnus tries to win that gelding with b4, then black can play c takes d5 with the counter threat of playing d4, forking white's knight and bishop. So best for white here is to play d6, achieving a well-protected passed pawn deep in the black position while renewing that threat of b4, trapping that sidelined filly on a5. But Magnus opts for the significantly inferior h5, which still might be winning, although Watnig is now able to play c takes d5, jumping 2 pawns ahead in material. So Magnus is really going to have to make his attack on the king side count, since black is the one now dominating the center. Best way to do that, according to the almighty engine, is to play an immediate queen to h2 in preparation for the grand opening of the h-file. And this would actually threaten a knight sacrifice on d5 that we're not going to get into. Suffice to say that the point of the sacrifice is to draw black's knight away from its defense of h7, when after h takes g6, white ends up infiltrating with the queen and bad things happen. Magnus does not play the best move queen to h2 though, but rather bishop to g5. Which looks sensible, immobilizing black's key defender of the center by pinning it to his queen, but this apparently allows black to equalize with knight to c6. Remember, black is 2 pawns up here, so even if Magnus were to grab the pawn on d5, he'd still be down in material, which is why he really needed to go all out on the kingside assault. Going after the material is just not going to cut it here. Watnig does not respond with the correct knight to c6 though. He instead plays a truly abysmal move, d4, needlessly relinquishing control of the e4 square, which is where Magnus now places his knight, attacking the pinned f6 knight with the second piece, while overloading the black queen, who in addition to providing necessary defense to f6, is also responsible for defending the knight on a5. So things are getting a bit awkward for black, but Watnig undoubtedly saw this coming, and he's got a little trick up his sleeve with the move knight takes e4, counterattacking the white queen on d2. Looks decent enough, but it's actually a losing move that white has but one way to effectively punish. What would you play here? The winning move is f takes e4. And full disclosure, we're probably not going to fully understand why. The engine's ways are not our ways, but we're going to try to at least get a rough idea. So keep this move f takes e4 on the brain, and we're going to contrast it with what Magnus plays, which is knight takes e4, which allows Watnig to equalize with the move f6. White has several playable options here. He can move his bishop just about anywhere, including to e3, taking advantage of the pin on black's d-pawn, but Magnus goes for a move that would have been totally winning if he had taken on e4 with the pawn instead of the knight, and that move is h takes g6, sacrificing his bishop on g5, which is now accepted with f takes g5. At which point, the move white really needs to play is rook takes h7. Magnus does not play this, seeing that black has bishop to f5, a move that would not be possible if white had played f takes e4 earlier instead of knight takes e4, with his knight still sitting on g3. In that scenario, white could gain a crushing advantage with the move queen to h2, and then possibly rook to h1 in another couple of moves. Black would have no easy way to pick off the pawn on g6, which in combination with white's triple stack on the h-file and or the move knight to h5, depending on how black tries to defend, will lead to the eventual demise of his king and subsequently the rest of his army, which, without the king's magical influence, will immediately fall lifeless. Now, fun fact, white can still hold the draw in this position with the move queen to h2, despite losing the g6 pawn to bishop takes g6, if he sacrifices more material with rook takes g7 check, king takes g7, and queen takes e5 check. When after king to g8 and rook takes d4 attacking the queen, queen to b6 keeping necessary defense of the knight on a5, rook to d7 threatening mate in 1, rook to f7 blocking, rook takes rook, king takes rook, and knight takes g5 check. Black has no good way to avoid perpetual check, and the position is a dead draw. How do I know this? Well, it's because I meticulously worked it all out, with a little help from the engine, which told me all of the best moves. Let's get back to the game though, shall we? Where in this position, Magnus does not play the absolutely essential rook takes h7, but instead uncorks one of the most savage and powerful losing moves he could possibly play. It's the nuclear sacrifice that you've all been waiting for, queen takes a5, whose sole purpose is to remove Black's defender of the c4 square, so that after queen takes a5, he can play bishop to c4 with check. Okay, looks a little terrifying. The Black king has no moves, assuming that you don't want the game to end on the next move, when after king to h8, rook takes h7 would be checkmate. So Watnig is going to have to give up some material here. It's not the end of the world. He is working with a pretty hefty surplus, and so after rook to f7, blocking the check, g takes f7 check, and king to f8, Black is still comfortably winning. Okay, maybe not comfortably winning, he's awkwardly winning, but he's winning nonetheless. Magnus really only has a rook for his lost queen, but he's not going to make life easy for Watnig. He continues knight takes g5, a strong move, opening the g-file, probably looking to grab on h7 next with check, which will add some defense to the promotion square of his passer on f7. We have bishop to f5, a good active response, and now rook d to g1, getting lined up on that g7 bishop. Next is rook to c8, hitting the bishop on c4, which Magnus drops back to b3. We have d3, hitting the pawn on c2 a third time. C takes d3 is of course not an option, as the pawn is pinned. Playing c3 would not be a very good idea, as that would give Black a passed pawn of his own on d3, not to mention a devastating rook sacrifice on c3, whose ramifications I'll leave to your imagination. So Magnus knows that it's now or never. He needs to make some magic happen on the king side, and so he plays knight takes h7 check. Black's only got 2 legal replies. If king to e7, then the bishop on g7 is lost. So we have bishop takes h7, and after rook takes h7, the g7 bishop is in jeopardy, now attacked twice. If it were to move to f6, then white could actually force mate in 2 with rook to g8 check, followed by the promotion of his pawn. So what to do is Black? Well, you can just let the bishop go with something like queen to c5, looking to come into e3 with check. That actually leads to a draw. Or you can play Black's single winning move in this position, which of course I invite you to try to spot. It's Black to play and win. What is the move? Well, it's the move now played by Watnig. Rook takes c2 check. Gotta hand it to the guy, or gal. Watnig has been finding all the top engine moves. If Magnus were to now play bishop takes c2, then Black would have queen to c5, attacking that pinned bishop, threatening mate in 1, also hitting the rook on g1. So white would have no choice but to defend with rook to g2, and then after queen to e3 check, everything just begins to fall apart. Magnus wisely avoids this road to perdition in the game, where after rook to c2 check, he plays king to b1. And now we have another brilliant move by Watnig. Rook to g2, defending his bishop, attacking the rook on g1, which of course may not capture on g2, lest white be mated in 2 moves beginning with queen to e1 check. Magnus replies rook to c1, threatening to come into c8. Watnig says, nay you don't, with queen to d8, a very good response, defending c8, while supporting a potential pushing of his passer to d2. Magnus now puts his rook on h1 with the apparent idea of trying to win the Black queen with rook to h8 check, bishop takes rook, and rook takes bishop check, followed by rook takes queen. But it isn't a threat just yet, since if that h1 rook leaves the first rank, then Black will be able to force checkmate in 2 with rook to g1. So Black's still doing just fine here, totally winning. The engine's actually giving a checkmate in 13 now, beginning with queen to f6, setting up the deadly battery towards the b2 square, which will be fully activated with e4 next. But there are only so many engine perfect moves that a human being is going to find, and it's at this point that Watnig finally cracks and commits a game-ending blunder with d2. A move which is about as natural looking as they come. He's putting his passer just 1 step away from promotion, but this move is actually so blunderous that it would have been better to make no move at all, if the rules of the game permitted such a thing, because if Black's pawn were still on d3 and it was White's turn to move again, Black would still be winning. But here, because the pawn is no longer guarding the c2 square, Magnus can now get away with rook to h8 check. And after bishop takes h8, rook takes h8 check, and king to e7, he's all good to grab the queen with rook takes d8. When after Watnig's response, rook to g1 check, white is not getting checkmated as Magnus is now able to put his king on c2. So I'm not sure exactly what was miscalculated here, but Magnus has d1 twice defended, so promoting the pawn is not going to work for black. King takes rook on d8 would of course allow Magnus to promote his pawn with check. So what's tried is rook to c1 check, but after king takes d2, it's just over, which is why Watnig now resigns the game, seeing that Magnus is threatening to both win his rook on c1 and to promote his pawn to a queen defended by his rook. So was that not one of the best bad sacrificial attacks you've ever seen Magnus play? How does he always seem to get away with this sort of thing? And what can we learn from it? I don't know, but I think I'm going to start trying to sacrifice my queen a whole lot more often. I don't even remember the last time I sacrificed my queen, which is just sad. But anyway, thank you for watching. Sack your queen early and often. There is no greater sacrifice in chess, unless you consider checkmate to be a sacrifice of the king. Hit that like button if you're someone who likes things. Consider subscribing to the channel if you enjoyed the content. Leave a comment with your favorite queen sacrificing story, and I will see you soon.